Welcome. My name is Derek Bishop, and I'm the co-founder of Culture Consultancy. We specialize in designing and embedding organizational cultures to support strategy execution, whether that be to support rapid growth, new operating models, whether digital transformation or M&A activity, or all around creating high performance cultures. Now, the topic for today's webinar in our Culture Conversation series is professional relationships. And we wanted to include this topic in our Culture Conversations series because we believe that people within any organization and the relationships that we have lies at the heart of a successful business. And so, those relationships are really essential tools for people and leaders and their teams alike. So, if you bring all your stakeholders and everybody along the journey of change and transformation that organizations are going on, then life becomes so much easier and you deliver the results faster and more easily and quicker. So, but the question is, are we all investing enough time and the right sort of time and effort in building the right relationships in the right way? So my guest this morning believes that professional relationships actually are rather underrated in business. And as a result, we make life so much more difficult for ourselves than actually it could be. He's the author of 5 books on networking and professional relationships, including a newly released one, Connected Leadership, and how professional relationships underpin executive success. I'm joined by Andy Lopata this morning, and I've known Andy as a speaker, author, and mentor for quite a number of years. I think it's somewhere around 13 to 14 years. And I've also had the benefits of being mentored by Andy personally as well. So welcome, Andy, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Derek. Good morning.
So I've got a number of questions I'm gonna run through with Andy about the topic of professional relationships, but I'm keen for the discussion that Andy and I sort of have to be guided by you as an audience as well. So if you have questions you want me to put to Andy, if you can add them in the chat function, and I'll do my absolute best as we go through the session in the next 55 minutes to incorporate them into the discussion. So please do use the chat function, and I'll keep an eye on it to incorporate your questions as we go. So without further ado, let's get cracking. And I thought actually let's start with some fun, foundational points, I guess, Andy. Now, as you feel professional relationships are so undervalued in business, what role do you see a leader's network and their connections play in them being a successful leader, and the impact that can have in an organization's results?
I think that leaders need to look at their professional relationships from 2 perspectives. One is the organization and the teams that they lead and how they can support that, and the other is for their career. And for their career might be a bit more obvious. We know that when we're looking for promotions, for example, relationships are so important. Businesses will have all types of systems in place to ensure fairness in recruitment. But the bottom line is that if your reputation precedes you, if people speak up for you, if they've seen and understand and communicate effectively the quality of your work, then you're going to be in prime position for any new role. And then there's, from the other side, from the personal element, there's mentoring, getting the advice and support that you need as a leader to face difficult challenges that happen all the time. And that leads to the other side, which is the benefit to the organization. And the reason that I say that professional relationships are undervalued in organizations is that businesses will invest huge amounts addressing the challenges that face them. And that list of challenges and objectives is huge, but you've already mentioned some of them. You talked about merger, you talked about digital change, you talked about business growth. I would add into their new product ideas, for example. I was interviewing someone for my podcast yesterday who was saying that it was the input she had from the people around her that helped her recognize that the product launch she was planning may not work, and to develop a plan B. So that she had something to fall back on and she was prepared. And it was only that external input that made the difference. So one of the things that I say in the book is that you can list all of these challenges and objectives and goals that business leaders work towards, underpinning them is your professional relationships. Because when you look at any challenge, the ability to turn to people who can give you the benefit of their own expertise or experience, who can open doors for you, so things get done more quickly, who can give you feedback and validate your ideas, is so important.
Right. Okay. And so, and I guess the current situation with COVID-19 and the change of human behavior and the consumer behavior and the variety of restrictions that we're all facing, and creates an extra level of challenge in terms of it's even heightened from just even digital transformation or new product launches. We've got this extra level of complexity. So what would you see as the opportunities that leaders should be really taking, in this environment, to really be leveraging their relationships, because it's almost like accelerated intensity?
It is, and what we've got here. I talked about people giving you the benefit of their experience. There are very few people, if any, that have got experience of the type of challenges facing businesses at the moment. Maybe if I was in the travel industry, I would be looking for people who had gone through, the challenges to that industry after 9/11. But that's probably the closest example I can think of in any sector to what we're dealing with at the moment. But as well as having people who can share their experience and point the way, you've also got the ability to share experiences in the moment and understand what other people are going through. The industry that I serve, the events, well, the two industries I predominantly serve, the events and the learning and development sectors, have been hit tremendously, which obviously impacts my business as a speaker and as a trainer. And our network of speakers and trainers are talking to each other all the time. I saw as people logged on that Will Kintish is on the call, and good morning, Will. Will's another speaker and trainer who focuses on networking skills. And Will and I had a long conversation the other day. What are you doing? How are you finding it? How's it impacting your business? How are you addressing the need to change? So those conversations are really important. I don't think there's a catch-all answer to your question, Derek, because every industry is different. So if you're in an industry that is absolutely swamped, I talked to someone yesterday who, because of the sector he serves, their needs have heightened. His business has actually doubled over the period of the lockdown. So for him, his challenge is finding the time to still engage with people. There are others who are in industries where there's just nothing happening at the moment, so they have the opportunity to really invest more time in conversations than they would normally be able to do. There's no commute, there's no traveling between meetings. Meetings are taking place online, so they might be a bit shorter and you can bounce from one to the other. So I think it really is dependent on the situation for you individually. But the key is to actually be thinking about this and saying, okay, well, what support do I need? What input do I need? And what time do I have to really dedicate to nurturing strong relationships at the moment?
But I guess one of the opportunities therefore is looking outside your sector and thinking actually what other sectors or organizations might be experiencing a similar or might have been through something that actually what you're saying is where can you share the learning and share the what people have been through and the experiences. So from that, it's about from what you're saying, it's about being very intentional about the relationships you're building. But is that this situation that we've been in over the last few weeks is quite extreme, and like you said, is different to anything we've been through before. But going from a standing start, therefore, if you suddenly realise that you need to reach out and build some new relationships, what are the fast track ways that you could therefore do that if you're in a crisis management situation and then also looking to accelerate through the next three phases of lockdown and growth, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because one of the biggest things that I stress is that a professional relationship strategy is for the medium to long term, not for short term. But there are things you can do. I received a connection request from someone 2 weeks ago, on LinkedIn as a result of the book being shared, and I could tell from the profile immediately that this was a very successful, high-level, influential person who I would want to forge a relationship with. And we exchanged a few messages. We had a conversation over LinkedIn. We reached the point very quickly where we realized that a conversation would be useful. So a week later, so last week, we spent an hour on Zoom. She's in New York, and it could have been longer. We found we had a lot in common. She agreed to come onto my podcast. I interviewed her yesterday, so I had another hour. In between, I introduced her into a New York-based Facebook group that I'm in for key connectors and influential people in New York. And I made a strong introduction for her. I didn't just plonk her in the group. I told everyone who she was and why I was introducing her. So I was giving her something all the time. I gave her some advice based on my experiences of publishing, and made and did a follow-up for a publisher she's interested in talking to. So I did lots of little things to help and support. We've had 2 long conversations in 2 weeks. I talk about 7 stages of professional relationship, 7 being friend and moving into personal relationship. I would say that we've accelerated that through stages 1 to 6 in ultra fast times, so it can be done. The keys to doing that are, number 1, continual meaningful conversation, and even if they're the other side of the world, using video conferencing. I mean, at the moment you probably got to do that with someone in the next street anyway, but using video conferencing just to create that engagement. We've had 2 long calls in 2 weeks. Communication in between. So I made a couple of connections for her by email. I introduced her into the Facebook group. She's been liking my posts on social media, and people deride that, but every time I see someone like a post or comment on a post, that reinforces it. I've commented on articles that she's written in the meantime. So there's been those micro touch points in between as well. And serving the other person. What can you do to help them? Because that's where you're really investing in the relationship. So I don't normally advocate fast tracking, but sometimes it just clicks, and sometimes it's necessary. And sometimes when it is essential, you have to make the big ask before you feel you'd normally be ready to, and you just have to own that.
Right, okay. And it's interesting because, for thinking back over the last 10 weeks, for me as a business leader, I've been a member of an entrepreneurs club, and actually it's been interesting how that this support and relationships that have been, have really been accelerated because we've all been in crisis management mode, and the amount of sharing and information and learning that we've had from Anna has definitely fast tracked a huge number of us through getting through the crisis management stage. So, and now that interestingly, some of those relationships are now moving on to, okay, what's the opportunity, and new potential partnerships are being, being developed or being explored, which we had probably, 12 weeks ago, I didn't know a number of these people at all, even though they're part of the club, with 500, 600 members. Of sort of, you don't get to know everybody that well. So I guess, for some, that crisis can accelerate it, but also from what you're saying, it's take the opportunity. You can, but it requires intentional acceleration to make it really work.
Yeah, so, sometimes it just happens, and that's wonderful when it does, and you need to be aware of that and help it along. No harm in adding intention to what happens naturally. It's interesting you mentioned the Entrepreneurs Club. I'm on a business acceleration program run by a guy called Baiju Solanki, and something struck me on the very first meeting, which was towards the end of last year, and that is that we were a room full of strangers. I didn't know anyone in that room apart from Baiju when it launched, and immediately we bonded, and that has been an amazing support network, and the relationships that I've built in a very short period of time within that support network have become very deep, very quickly. And I think there were two initial factors and then a third factor. The 2 initial factors, one is that we had a common bond, and that was Beiju. And the trust we had in him and who he brought together meant that all of the normal skepticism that you might have when you sit down with a group of strangers dissipates. And I used to run networking groups, and I did see this happen quite a lot, but this was particularly strong because we were all probably at the same place in our journey as well. So there was that associational bond, if you like. And the second element that just brought us together really quickly was, and it goes to what I was just saying, that we were all working towards the same goal. So I'm supporting you and you're supporting me. Reciprocity is built in straight away, and we're learning from helping each other. And I think that the group that you're talking about is built on similar grounds. And then the third factor is when we went into lockdown mode and we're all together in the dark, if you like, and supporting each other. So that brought us even closer together. So yeah, a very, very similar experience.
Yeah. And I've just noticed Wendy Harris has put a comment in about, if it's right, it will have a life of its own. And I guess that you're following your instinct in some respects, aren't you, about actually this is worth exploring. But I guess as business leaders, we're time is a precious commodity, and and so we could spend a lot of time building relationships. And one of the things you'll know about us, Andy, is that we specialize in all around building cultures of innovation and within organizations. And so one of the things that we talk about is about actually having the right innovation mix, and part of that is about having focus for your innovation rather than just being a free-for-all. You need to focus your innovation. So I'm guessing something similar applies here in terms of your developing your relationships. So you need to have some sort of focus and a mix to it, do you? And if so, how do you go about determining that right sort of mix?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I talk about the difference between a strategic or partnership mindset when you're building relationships and a relational mindset when you're building relationships. This idea that if it's right, it has a life of its own. You will meet people and just click. You have ideas and things in common. You have rapport. You like them, and you want to stay in touch. And that is absolutely fine. And at some point in that journey, you may be able to help them or they may be able to help you, but you don't necessarily know what that looks like. It doesn't make sense in that moment you meet. And those types of connections are really, really important. I made the comment that we met through a group called Academy Black Star, as you say, about 13, 14 years ago, perhaps. And there became a group of us that became very close friends and quite a tight-knit group. And I made the observation at one point a few years ago that we were all, I think there was a whole group of us within 2 years of each other in age. And at a relatively young age with 20, 30 years or more in business ahead of us. So if we kept that bond, which many of us have, and we stayed in touch, who knows how we could support each other and help each other going forward in the future. So I think the relational mindset is important, and just allowing relationships to flourish because they feel right. But the partnership strategic element is important as well. So what I talk about when I'm talking about that is saying, who do I need strong relationships with in order to achieve my objectives? So let's take a couple of examples. If you take the personal example, I was mentoring a client on Friday who's looking to reach, she's already at a very, very senior level in a government organization and she wants to reach the top. Well, what's the next step on that ladder? She's just taken a new job. What's your job in 2 years' time? The next step, or whatever the time scale is. Who are the key people who are going to be influential in that decision, and how strong is your relationship with them now? So you can be strategic in terms of understanding where the next step is and who can influence that, and you can do that equally for professional goals. So if you're looking at winning over a new client or winning more work with an existing client, understanding who the key people are you need strong relationships with. So I've come up with what I call a relationship chart, or my 3I pie, because I think there's 3 types of people that you need strong relationships with within a stakeholder organization. And you can look at any stakeholder in a process and say, right, which relationships do I need here? And the three types of people are people who influence the key decisions, because most decisions aren't made by one person. They're made by board, particularly as you go up in scale, in size of decision. So you need people who have influence. It's no good if you know one person in that stakeholder group, but 10 people are making the decision and the other 9 don't know who you are. You need people who are intermediaries or introducers, so they know the key people and they can open the door for you to have a conversation with them. And you need people who give you information, ideas and insight, so you actually know what to say when you know who the influential people are, or how to help that person open the door for you. So you can, if you map out that stakeholder and say, these are the influential people, these are the people who have access, and these are the people who know what's going on in the organization, who give me feedback and ideas, then you say, who of those people do I know, but my relationship isn't strong enough with them yet? And you can seek to build the relationship. Who of those people do I know and have a strong relationship with, but I'm not asking them the right questions? I'm not allowing them to support me in the way they would be happy to do so because we have a strong relationship. And who don't I know at all? So you can be very focused and very strategic about it. And the only thing I would add to that is you're strategic in your planning. You're strategic in the way you approach it, but you're relational in the way you engage with them, so they don't feel manipulated or used. And every interaction you have should be authentic. It should be about liking that individual and finding what you have in common and finding the rapport. So you're looking for what I call a blended mindset, part relational, part strategic. But the person who you're engaging with should just feel it's natural, because that's exactly what it should be.
Yeah. And I guess that equally applies, yeah, whether that be, yeah, internally out to clients, potential partnerships, other industries. So you can adopt that same approach. No, you just look at that, use that approach, no matter what it is that you're where you need to build those relationships, you just apply that approach, do you?
Yeah, so if I take one of my clients, for example, so I work with a big client in the pharmaceutical industry, I'll look at the different stakeholder groups. So I will say, within my client's organization, who are the influencers, who are the intermediaries, who are my sources of insight, ideas and information? I would then say, well, okay, that's within my client, but who else in the speaking industry do I know that serves clients in the pharmaceutical industry and have influence, access, and can give me insights? And then I might say, well, okay, who else do I need to know in the industry, the pharmaceutical industry as a whole? So that's 3 stakeholder groups, all who can help me with growing my presence in that client and in that industry. And I can run that exercise independently in all 3 groups.
Mm, okay, so I guess that therefore, if we follow that theme on, that can apply from some different levels. And if we think about it from an innovation point of view, where do you see relationships fit in that? You know, helping to fuel innovation, and you know, particularly for a number of businesses now as they're looking at as we come through the next phase of the pandemic, and actually, what's the opportunity? You know, some businesses will be pivoting, some businesses will be open up new propositions or enter new markets. Where do the relationships fit in all of those dynamics then of looking at the growth?
Again, they're absolutely key. For me, innovation is a huge area that's dependent on relationships. I worked last year with a German medical devices manufacturing company, and they had just moved from having I think 13 different offices with their staff spread around, to opening an innovation center and bringing everyone together at their headquarters. And they created this innovation center. They put in hot desking and breakout spaces and so on. But what they found out was people were still stuck to their old habits and stuck to their old teams. So they hot desk, but hey, this is my hot desk, and this is the same hot desk I'll come to every day. So the silos were still in operation, and as you'll know, silos inhibit innovation, because we'll go back to your earlier point. You talked about getting ideas from different industries and different sectors. You know, theory called cognitive diversity. You know, diversity of thought is key. And that happens inside organizations as well. You know, if you're siloed in your thinking, you're not sharing experiences and responses and new ideas, and you're inefficient in your innovation because you're just repeating the same mistakes time and again. So I went into work with them to just to create the mindset across the organization that actually we need to be building relationships. So creating mastermind groups where that they would get together in small groups and just share what they're working on and share some of their challenges, but across different departments, for example. And a couple of interesting things happened. This happened both with that organization, and also my pharmaceutical client picked up on this as well, and started innovating around the research stage. And what they found was, in my client in Germany, they said that some of the people in the roles where they needed to innovate, so in the development roles, were getting input through these mastermind groups from people in sales and marketing functions who they would never normally ask for their opinion, and it helped them make breakthroughs. And similarly with the pharmaceutical client, the guys in the research team were saying, right, we're going to go out now and we're going to bring in people from different backgrounds to share with them what we're trying to achieve, where our bottlenecks are, and get their input, people who weren't necessarily scientists. So I think that though you need trust for that to happen, you need belief in the process, and you need faith. You know, there's so much, particularly the two examples I gave, there's so much wrapped up that can inhibit those conversations if the relationship isn't strong enough. Lack of trust, confidentiality, and a range of other things. So the stronger the relationship, the more people will want to contribute and will be open to those contributions as well.
And it's an interesting point on what you mentioned there, Andy, about trust, because I think, you know, in the environment we're now, where, you know, we're remote working, many organizations are continuing remote working, and yeah, it's likely to be the new longer term operating model, that it's not like everybody's going to return to the workplace. Yeah, there'll probably be a hybrid of some working remotely, sometimes in the workplace, depending on the nature of the organization. But trust is actually an underlying requirement to be able to, for leaders to be able to effectively lead and manage their teams in this remote working environment. So how can you know, you accelerate that building of trust through the relationships, just to help supercharge that as much as possible? Because it's difficult to do when you're not physically together. So what sort of ideas and tips have you got for building those relationships and trust on, you know, through mediums like this, or where you just can't physically get together?
Yeah, I think first of all, just to say that in that type of relationship, the trust is imperative both ways. So it's the teams having trust in their leader to lead them, and it's the leader trusting their teams as well. I was reading an article that was in the Times, I think, last week, where they were saying that leaders will start to lose control. It will move, that's probably the wrong phrase, but we'll move away from the leadership control approach as people get used to working remotely, because they'll take on more independent thought. And I think that there's an element where leaders need to trust that, because otherwise you're going to get a conflict. And there's an element where there has to be an agreement about how this sits in place, and actually a focus on that, and a conversation about it. So it will be interesting to see how that develops. Couple of thoughts. The first thing is that leaders will think that just because we have a team meeting once a week on Zoom, I'm talking to all my staff, or I'm talking to everyone because I'm just checking in with them on their work and so forth. I think that when you're working remotely, it's even more important for the leader to talk to their teams on a personal level, rather than just a transactional level. So just a check-in, pick up the phone and say, how are you doing? You know, mental health is a huge issue through this lockdown, mental well-being. You know, people are working from home, balancing homeschooling, working in an environment that's not always conducive to concentration, and stress levels are going up, not just work related stress levels, but stress around your family's health, stress around your community, stress around a range of things. And leaders need to be aware of that and just check in. without any agenda. So little calls just to say, how are you? And actually, it may feel like a step backwards, but picking up the phone occasionally rather than Zooming. I think that when we Zoom, it's exhausting. We're not making eye to eye contact. For me to look you in the eyes, I have to look away from your face and look at the camera.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real impediment to relationship building over social media. If I look at your face, you feel I'm looking away from you. So we can't make genuine eye-to-eye contact as easily. So with that in mind, pick up the phone and just phone people. And also people are doing that less and less because we're Zooming more and more. And you always go for the technology that stands out from the rest. So I think that would be one thing. And then the other is being vulnerable and authentic and not pretending you know anything. I think authenticity, it's an oft bandied around word. It's become a cliche almost, but I'm a great believer that the words and phrases become cliches for a reason, because people keep repeating them for a reason. And authenticity, vulnerability are absolutely key in leadership for me and in trusted relationships. I interviewed the head of culture and talent at Grant Thornton for my podcast, and we were talking particularly about this vulnerability issue. And he said that the CEO of Grant Thornton was carrying out a regular call with the whole company from his second bedroom, and that natural approach, that natural authenticity, not trying to be someone that in that moment he's not, was really working well in terms of bringing the firm together and engaging the team. So that struck out for me. So authenticity would be key there as well.
And I think one of the other thing is that the whole thing about asking how people are, there's numerous research that demonstrates that actually, if you ask how people are, then they won't necessarily give the real answer first off. And it's on that vulnerability and authenticity point of view, it's about actually offering up maybe perhaps the things that as leaders we're grappling with, or it's been tough, juggling, homeschooling, etc., and almost demonstrating a little bit of, it's not easy for me. It's saying that it's not okay. It's not absolutely okay for me either. And by being a bit more upfront and open, actually that invites the other person to be more honest and real about what's going on. So I think that ties in with your authenticity in terms of really being real and human about it. Obviously you need to do that with sensitivity, but it's about actually just showing, this is not easy for me either. This is what I'm doing. How are you feeling, sort of thing. Yeah.
I interviewed Phil Gardner for the book, and Phil is he was the sales and marketing director of Thomas Cook when Thomas Cook went into liquidation. And he said, he was talking to me about the day that the company went bust, and he had to go into work. And he talked to me about just saying to people, this is going to be a really difficult day. And he had to make 200 people redundant, 97% of his team. I think he kept on about 13 people to help with the transition. And he said the fact that he had always been authentic. I'd interviewed Phil before for my next book, which comes out towards the end of the year. And in that he had talked about one of the earliest things he learned from I guess he came from, sales and marketing director, that bullish approach that didn't work for him early on. And he learned early on that it's better to say, I don't know, even as a leader, and start to get the answers. So he had built that relationship with his team over time to get to the point that when he had this awful message to share, it was, people were there for him. And they it wasn't great news for him to impart or for them to receive, but they understood where he was coming from. And what was interesting, he told me he was in the canteen to get lunch, and someone he didn't really know, quite junior, came up to him and just said, "How are you?" And it just hit him. It hit him so hard, and he sort of stumbled through the conversation, and then had to go and hide in the loo for 10 minutes and just really cry. And he went and told her that afterwards, and gave her that feedback. And I think that connection can be so powerful. And whatever news you have to impart, however difficult the situation you have to handle, it doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it makes it smoother, because people understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I guess in that situation, he'd over quite a period of time, he'd been nurturing those relationships, and so when he faced making that, those difficult decisions and announcements, he sort of had the strength of relationship already there. I guess if I take a look at the scenario now of there's going to be some pretty difficult decisions that some business leaders are going to have to make over the coming weeks and months. And some staff will be very concerned about their own job security. So how, that puts a leader now who's trying to develop and continue to nurture relationships internally in a quite an awkward position, in a situation that is going to go on for several, for quite a while. So what tips would you give to someone, to leaders, to actually balance that in terms of understanding people will be uncertain about what the future holds, but as leaders and within teams, we still need to develop those relationships? How do you tread that line when you're in the situation here and now?
Well, number one is that those relationships can stay in place and they can still work for you or for both parties, even if you end up not working together. Someone who's forced to leave a company at some point but has a strong relationship with that organization or the leaders of that organization is going to be more likely to talk positively in the future, despite what they went through, about that organization than someone who wasn't. So and you never know, we've talked already about, relationships over 10, 20, 30 years. You never know when you'll cross paths again. So I think that if it's natural to do so, it's good to build relationships anyway. Not, I've talked about the strategic element of it, but you don't build a relationship just to use people or just because they have a job. You do it because it's the right thing to do, and strategically it's going to help you as well. That goes back to my blended mindset approach. I think taking what I was talking about, Phil's journey, the authenticity is really important. As a leader, you can't share everything, but if you have a trusted relationship with your team, they'll appreciate that. And if you turn around and say, look, there are things going on I honestly would love to share, but I can't, but here's what I can tell you, I think people appreciate that as well. And that's the trust element yet again. And making sure that when there is bad news to be delivered, it's delivered by you and not found out secondhand would be key. I was reading an article this morning by a Times journalist who'd suffered from coronavirus in the very early stages and was on a ventilator and in intensive care. And he said that the staff, I think it was at St Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which was one of the first hospitals dealing with cases, this was back in March. The staff at the hospital were told, when dealing with family members, to be very open about the negative side, but equally not being, to be non-committal, but encouraging about the chances. So they would say, we don't know that he'll come through, but we're hopeful he'll respond to treatment. And I think that the temptation can be to just say we're hopeful that he'll respond to treatment and not mention the first part. And then that's when the bad news comes as a bigger shock. And I think that's a great example of how to balance the conversations you have the right way.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Andy. Before we move on to the next question, just a request for the audience. If you do have particular questions you want me to put to Andy, then please do drop them into the chat. I can see Will has shared some thoughts on some of the conversation, and Christine has as well. But if you've got specific questions you'd like me to put to Andy, then please do drop them into the chat. Just thinking back to your example you gave earlier on about where they created an innovation center, they created the space, but relationships weren't naturally sort of developed. And, you clearly feel that relationships should be a core part of how an organization's way of working. And hence, we'd frame that as being part of the culture and just natural things that happen. You touched on a couple of barriers that you saw in that organizations, but what typically do you see the barriers are within organizations that that need to be unblocked to enable relationships development to really become part of the culture and the natural way things are done?
Well, I would two immediately spring to mind. The first one, we're talking about leadership. I think culture, is built top down. You can build bottom up as well, and it's good to mix the two. But if leaders don't lead by example, then you've got a challenge. So leaders need to take responsibility for encouraging a relationship driven culture. That means trusting your teams more. It means allowing them to spend time with people internally and externally of the organization, building relationships, and not solely focusing. This is probably the biggest challenge, not solely focusing on short-term objectives. I've worked for US corporates where every decision is based on the likely impact on the next quarter's listing on the New York Stock Exchange. And that's why I left in the end. I couldn't operate with that kind of short-term thinking. And organizations that are only focused on short-term objectives are creating huge issues for relationship building, because you invest in relationships just as you invest in a pension. You don't invest, you say £1,000 in your pension and then try and take it out the next month. You let it in there for decades. And relationships to a degree are the same. You will have some that will pay out immediately and some over medium to long term. So there's that trust to allow that to happen that comes from the top, and it's got to filter through all the levels of management that it's okay. And some of your staff will take liberties with that, and you have to be okay with that. You'll know who they are pretty quickly, and then you can take suitable action. But others of your staff will thrive, and the value they'll bring back into the business will more than make up for the loss of the ones that are taking liberties. So that's one thing. The second is breaking down silos. And I see a lot of this within organizations where people will complain that they don't get the cooperation of other parts of the organization that they need to meet their project objectives. And all they're thinking about is, I've asked for this and they're not delivering, or they're not getting back to me. They're not asking themselves why that other department would. The people who are working in that other department have their own goals, their own objectives, their own pressure. And why should they put you top of the list? And a relationship culture shifts that. Everyone working together for the whole is a little bit trite and cliched perhaps, but there's a lot of merit in that. But actually, I think it's more at the individual level as well. Communication between people, building relationships and friendships between people who work across the organization, so that people will do what you ask them to, because they want you to succeed, because they want to help you. So I think that's a key element in building a relationship culture as well. But silos, bottlenecks, team-based bonuses and so on all work against that cross-organizational communication.
Yeah, okay. And I guess the things here are about, it is that it's the time, it's the balance of productivity, relationship development, etc. So there's a number of, and the key thing from what you're saying is that actually it's about doing it with in a focused way. So having your clear focus of actually your strategic versus your relationship that you need to do, and where do you need to build those relationships given what you're trying to achieve. So it is about, it comes back to that being focused about what you're trying to do, and it's not just a random go out and build a load of relationships, which will consume a lot of time.
Yeah, it is. But it is the blended approach that I talked about earlier, because if you are too strategic and too focused, you will come across as cold and manipulative, and you'll burn relationships that could be valuable to you in the long term. So I think it's about being open to relationships naturally forming, but also being strategic about where the gaps are and who you do need to get to know better, and blending the two approaches. The other thing that you touched on there that I think is really, really important is that the biggest objection, the biggest challenge that my clients face is time. How do I find the time to build these relationships? And if you are strategic in the way you think about this, then you recognize that time invested in relationships pays back in terms of greater results, greater efficiencies, and saving time elsewhere. So again, we're back to medium to long-term thinking again.
Which actually, I just picked up a question in the chat around, you know, it's how do you know your relationships are getting better? How would you measure the improvement so that you know that you should continue, or the organization should continue to allow the time and money to be invested in nurturing those relationships, as you say, because some of it is going to be more medium to long term. So how do you measure it to sort of help convince and justify that it's the right way of doing things within the organization?
I think it's very intuitive and instinctive. And if I can share this, I haven't had a chance to ask you in advance, but going back quite a few years, you know, this worked with you because you were rebuilding the business after an operation, and you needed to get some referrals and build some business. And we sat down and talked about it. And your biggest hurdle was feeling comfortable asking people for help. And I asked you to list, I think, 5 people who might be in a position to help you, and then to put down scores for how willing they would be to do so and how well they would understand how to do so. And to score it, so I asked you to score it 1 to 10, and I said, picture yourself as that person when you're asking, and just feel in your stomach, in your belly, how they feel as a response to that question. And you did that, and you just went 9, 10, 9, 9, 10, or something like that. And I said, how do you feel about asking now? And you said, not a problem. And I think it is instinctive. I've got, rather than the 1 to 10 scale, which I still use, I mentioned earlier, I have the 7 stages of professional relationship. And I think you can, if you understand those, you can then score. So you've got level 1 is we recognize each other. So we met each other at an event a couple of weeks ago. We bump into each other again. We recognize each other from that previous conversation. If we never follow up beyond that, that recognition stage will last a limited amount of time, and soon we'll be out of each other's network. Stage 2 is we know each other. I see you across the room. I don't just recognize you. I know who you are and what you do. There's name recognition there as well, if your name comes up in conversation. Then we go into, you know, you'll have heard the know, like, and trust that Bob Berg talked about. So stage 3 is like, we like each other. Stage 4 is trust. I think like is an optional. It's a good one to have in there, and it will accelerate things, but people will support you if they trust you, but the rapport isn't necessarily there. They might not if they dislike you, but there doesn't necessarily have to be a positive likability factor, if you like. And then the next 3 stages, when you're really at the heart of each other's network, if you like, is support, advocate, and friend. So support means if I picked up the phone to you and said, Derek, would you help me with something? You would go, of course I would, I'll be happy to. Advocate or advocate is where I don't need to pick up the phone. You're recognizing opportunities. You're coming to me and saying, I thought of you for this. And friend is self-explanatory. You're moving into personal networks much more. If you think about the people that you've listed in your relationship chart, your 3-eye pie, and you look at them, I think instinctively you'll know roughly where you are on that journey. And I have an exercise that I do on some of the webinars that I run, where I ask people what they think the ideal level should be and where they think their average is now. And every time I've done that, the average has come out at about, average as it is now, about 3.5, the ideal level about 5.5. So there's journeys to be made there. But I think that going back to the original question, how do you know? I think when you know that journey, you can then look at it and think of an individual and think instinctively, intuitively, where do I feel they are? And you won't be far wrong.
Which sort of, just thinking about that leads me on to one of the other questions that's just been shared here, is about how many relationships can you realistically manage as a business leader? Because you'll have all your existing ones, you might pursue other ones with very, but how many can you realistically be actually sustaining a relationship with?
I laugh because it's a very common question, and I have probably a very unsatisfactory answer in that I'm not going to give you a number. There's research out there. The most famous is the Dunbar number, which says we know 150 people. We can manage 150 people at any one time. There's Girard's law that talks about 250. Both of them came before the days of social media. Both of them are widely misunderstood. That wasn't actually the premise of Dunbar's research, but that's how it's often used. The reason I don't come up with a flat answer is that networks aren't flat structures. They're not a finite number of people, and you know, my network today is 150 people and there's no one else in it. Instead, it's that 7 stages, and people move through it and around it and in and out of it. And once you get people to stages, particularly 5, 6 and 7, they don't necessarily require ongoing nurturing. You might be in touch regularly purely because your relationship is so strong and your work might keep you close. But once people are at that level, I've found I can go 5 years, 10 years without talking to someone. They'll pick up the phone to me, or I'll pick up the phone to them, and we just pick up where we left off. So when you think of your network like that, you don't have to be managing a set number at any one time. You need to be investing more time in your 1s, 2s and 3s to bring them deeper into your network so the relationship sticks. But once it's stuck, as long as it's strong enough and based on the right things, then you know, you can go without talking on a regular basis. Mike Gordon's on the call at the moment. I can see you on screen, Freddie. So hi. I mean, we rarely see each other these days. We've known each other for a long time, but we got to that friend level. So that if I picked up the phone to you or you picked up the phone to me, I'm pretty confident neither of us is going to be going, well, who's this? So you don't have to be managing a set number at any one time.
And I guess that it doesn't matter whether you're talking about professional relationships or personal relationships, that same principle applies. It's applied exactly the same thinking to it from both either a personal or a professional relationship perspective. Yeah.
And social media helps as well. I mentioned that the 2 studies I referred to were pre-social media. I always talk about one of the biggest benefits of social media is it helps keep you insight in mind. If you are active on social media, people will feel connected to you even if you're not talking to them directly. And if you support their posts, then that bond is stronger. I had an email the day after my newsletter went out with the book launch, and it was from someone I last saw, I would think 32 years ago. And we were at sixth form together, so I've aged myself for you very quickly. But we were at sixth form together, and we were good friends at sixth form. And after we went off to university, we didn't stay in touch. But then through Facebook, of course, you reconnect with a few people, and we chatted a couple of times on Facebook when we reconnected. But we're not in touch there. And he emailed me. He subscribes to my newsletter, and he said, I've just bought the book. I really enjoy following you on social media and seeing what you're up to. And I still feel it's weird. We haven't seen each other for over 30 years, but I still feel connected. And I think that's a really powerful illustration of the power of social media. You know, you have to have that strong friendship initially. I've talked to friends from school and sixth form where they've mentioned other people in my class at the time and I don't remember them. So we obviously didn't have a strong enough friendship. So that I don't think would work in the same way on social media. But if you had a good friendship in the first place, 32 years later, you could pick it up again.
Okay. So I'm very conscious of that the time has flown by, Andy. So I guess for me, there's just one sort of final question, which we've covered a lot of ground in 55 minutes. So what would be the top 3-4 things that you would want people to take away from this session and take action on? Because this is all, it's all about, taking action. So what would be your top 3-4 things that you'd recommend people really think about and take away?
So the first one is to be intentional, but not to be strategic without being robotic about this. So still be a human being in the way you connect with people, and be authentic in the way you connect with people, but have some thought behind it while leaving scope for just natural relationships to flourish. The second most important thing is to think about that 7 stages of professional relationship. When we talk about growing my network or building my network, people automatically think about, I've got to go meet new people. Start with the people you already know and focus on getting them from levels 1, 2, and 3 to 4, 5, and 6. And you'll find it, going back to your previous question, easy to manage that network because it's not too big, and the relationships are deeper. So when you've got people who support an advocate and are advocates for you, then your return from those relationships, to using Rory Murray's phrase, is going to be so much more powerful. And then I think that the third thing would be the 3i pie, the relationship chart. Understand within each key stakeholder, which relationships do you have but they're not deep enough, which relationships do you have but you're not asking the right questions, and which relationships don't you have at all that you need to have. And then the final thing, if you're going to do one thing as a result of this to kick you off, start the journey, pick up your phone or go to LinkedIn, scroll through your contacts, find someone who you have dropped contact with, and just reach out to them and pick up the phone and just say, I was thinking about you, how are you doing? And that leads me on to my final point, and that's the golden rule. And that is, where possible, 90% of your outreach to your network should be about them and not about you. So pick up the phone when you don't need the help, not when you do, or so that you can when you do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you ever so much, Andy. Really appreciate you joining today and sharing. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground and a lot of content. So sharing your perspectives, your advice all around those professional relationships. Thanks also for everybody who's joined us today and for adding in the questions that we've been able to pick up and include in our discussion. If you'd like to continue the conversation, then you can just share our contact details here. So if you want to continue the culture conversation and the professional relationships conversation, then feel free to reach out to us on any of these contact details. And if you want to revisit the webinar, then we'll be posting up on our website in the next few days, and we can provide a link to that. So feel free to have a look over it again to pick up on the rich content that Andy's talked through. Our next session in our coach conversation session is on the Thursday, the 18th of June. And the topic for that session is all about how to ensure great employee engagement and productivity as your teams return to the new normal, return into the new normal sort of workplace. And for that session, I'll be joined by Piers Mummery, who's the UK Managing Partner of Tech CXO, and also Nigel Watson from the team here at Culture Consultancy. So if you'd like to join us on that session, please look out for the registration details on LinkedIn and social media. Or if you just want to leave a yes in the chat function now, then we'll sort of, before you leave today, then we'll just add you to the invite, and so you can join us on Thursday the 18th. So thanks again. I look forward to seeing you again. And again, thank you, Andy, for sharing all your ideas and thoughts and advice.